In the spring of 1967, in a converted garage gymnasium tucked into the hills of Los Angeles, a moment was about to unfold that would reshape the trajectory of martial arts in America. 9 seconds, that's all it would take for one man's certainty to shatter like glass against concrete. Joe Louis stood 6 feet 2 inches tall, weighed 215 pounds of combat-tested muscle, and carried himself with the unmistakable confidence of a man who had never been defeated. At 23 years old, he was already a legend in traditional karate circles. A United States Marine Corps veteran, fresh from Okinawa, with a reputation that preceded him like thunder before lightning. His knuckles bore the calcified ridges of 10,000 Makiwara strikes. His shins had been conditioned against wooden posts until the bone density resembled iron. He'd won every tournament he'd entered that year, each opponent falling to his devastating reverse punch with mechanical predictability. And now, standing in the doorway of Bruce Lee's school, he was about to issue a challenge that would define the rest of his life. The garage smelled of liniment, oil, sweat, and the distinctive metallic tang of heavy bags that had absorbed years of impact. Late afternoon sunlight filtered through high windows, casting long geometric shadows across the worn wooden floor. The space wasn't large, maybe 40 feet by 30, but it possessed an intensity that made it feel sacred. Mirrors lined one wall, reflecting the handful of students who had stopped their training to observe the newcomer with quiet curiosity. So, Bruce Lee was teaching a private lesson when Louis arrived. He stood 5 feet 7 and weighed 135 pounds, wearing simple black cotton pants and a white t-shirt that revealed the sculptural definition of muscles that seemed carved rather than built. At 26 years old, he moved with a fluidity that seemed to defy physics, demonstrating a technique to a student with movements so fast they appeared to blur at the edges. His voice carried a distinctive Hong Kong accent, precise and articulate, explaining body mechanics with the precision of an engineer and the passion of a poet. He noticed Louis immediately. It was impossible not to. The man filled the doorway with physical presence and something else, something Louis himself probably couldn't name. Expectation. Challenge. The particular energy of someone accustomed to being the most dangerous person in any room. Bruce finished his demonstration, spoke quietly to his student, then turned to face the newcomer with eyes that seemed to perceive layers beneath the surface. "Can I help you?" His voice was calm, conversational, but there was an alertness in his posture that suggested complete readiness. Louis stepped inside, his boots heavy against the floor. "I'm Joe Louis. I've heard a lot about you." He paused, letting his gaze travel deliberately around the small school, taking in the students, the equipment, the space itself. His expression carried a mixture of curiosity and skepticism, the look of a scientist examining a hypothesis he suspected might be flawed. "I've heard you claim traditional martial arts are too rigid, that all those kata-in forms are outdated." "I don't claim anything," Bruce replied, moving to the center of the floor with the unhurried confidence of someone who had navigated this particular conversation many times before. "I observe. I test. I evolve." "That's interesting." Louis folded his arms across his massive chest. "Because I've spent 3 years in Okinawa, training under masters whose lineages go back centuries. I've won every major tournament on the West Coast this year, and from where I'm standing, the traditional method seemed to work just fine." The other students had gone completely still. One of them, a lean Chinese-American man named Dan Inosanto, recognized the tone in Louis's voice, the particular frequency of a challenge being issued. He'd seen this before. Men arrived at Bruce's school regularly, carrying their credentials like weapons, seeking to prove that their style, their teacher, their tradition was superior. None of them left the same way they arrived. Bruce's expression remained neutral, but something flickered in his eyes. Not anger, something closer to recognition. He understood what Louis represented, the pinnacle of traditional training. All that disciplined power, harnessed within rigid classical forms. He also understood what Louis didn't know yet. What he couldn't know until the knowledge was demonstrated in the only language that transcended words. "Your tournament record is impressive," Bruce said, his tone carrying genuine respect. "You're clearly a skilled fighter. But tell me something, Joe, in those tournaments, how many different ways were you allowed to win?" Louis's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "What do you mean?" "I mean the rules. Points scored for specific techniques, no strikes to certain targets, no grappling below the waist, fighting within parameters designed to showcase traditional forms." Bruce moved slightly, shifting his weight in a way that somehow made him seem simultaneously more relaxed and more dangerous. "That's not fighting. That's a sport. And there's nothing wrong with sport. But don't mistake it. You think you could do better? The challenge was explicit now, hanging in the air between them like electricity before a storm. The garage had gone absolutely silent. Even the distant sounds of Los Angeles traffic seemed to fade, as if the world itself was holding its breath. Bruce looked at Lewis for a long moment. He saw the pride there, the certainty forged in 1,000 victories, the belief system constructed on the foundation of traditional excellence. He could destroy that belief system easily. A few seconds of movement, the right application of speed and timing, and Joe Lewis's certainty would crumble. He would leave the school humiliated, his confidence shattered, his understanding of martial arts fundamentally broken. That would be easy. What Bruce chose to do instead would be much, much harder. I don't need to prove anything to you, Joe, he said quietly. But if you're genuinely interested in learning rather than competing, I'll show you something, not to humiliate you, not to destroy your confidence, but to expand your understanding of what's possible. Lewis felt something unexpected twist in his chest. The response wasn't what he'd anticipated. He'd come here expecting Bruce to either back down or accept the challenge with aggression. This calm offer to teach rather than defeat was somehow more unnerving than any fighting stance could have been. Show me what? His voice had lost some of its edge, curiosity beginning to compete with pride. How much time do you think you need to defend yourself against an attack? Bruce asked, moving to stand about 10 feet away from Lewis. From the moment you see it coming to the moment you react. Lewis considered the question, recognizing it as fundamental to combat theory. A trained fighter can react in maybe half a second, a quarter second, if you're really sharp in anticipating the movement. And how long do you think it takes to cross this distance and strike? Bruce gestured to the space between them. Roughly 10 feet of empty floor. Depends on the technique, Lewis replied, his competitive analysis kicking in automatically. A good fighter could cover that in under a second, maybe 3/4 of a second with a proper lunge. What if I told you I could hit you 5 times before you even register the first strike? Bruce's voice remained conversational, almost casual, but there was something absolutely certain in his tone. Not because you're slow, you're clearly not, but because the traditional method you've been taught has built-in limitations that you don't even know exist. Lewis's expression hardened. That's impossible. Is it? Bruce turned to Dan Inosanto. Dan, count to 9 slowly, 1 second per count. Dan nodded, understanding immediately what was about to happen. He'd seen variations of this demonstration before, but never was someone of Joe Lewis's caliber. This would either be the most important teaching moment in the big man's life, or it would create an enemy. Everything depended on what Lewis chose to do with what he was about to experience. Joe, Bruce said, his voice dropping to a tone that commanded absolute attention, I'm going to stand here. You're going to assume your fighting stance. When Dan begins counting, I'm going to move. I'm going to hit you. Controlled strikes, no actual damage, multiple times before he reaches 9. You're going to try to stop me using every technique you've learned, every block, every counter, every defensive strategy from your traditional training. Use all of it. Hold nothing back. He paused, letting the parameters settle. But understand this, I'm not doing this to embarrass you. I'm doing this to break through the limitation in your perception. What you think is possible is constrained by what you've been taught to see. I'm going to show you what you haven't been able to see yet. Are you willing to experience that? Lewis felt his heart rate elevate. This wasn't the challenge he'd expected to issue, but it was the challenge he was being offered. Everything in his training, every instinct forged through 3 years of rigorous discipline, told him this was impossible. No one could move fast enough to land 5 strikes against a trained fighter in 9 seconds when that fighter was prepared and defensive. No one. I'm ready, he said, dropping into his traditional karate stance. Left leg forward, weight distributed precisely 60-40, hands chambered at his ribs in the classical position that had served him flawlessly through dozens of fights. The other students moved back, creating space. The late afternoon light seemed to intensify, illuminating the 2 fighters in the center of the floor. David against Goliath, except no one was certain anymore who was who. Bruce stood casually, hands at his sides, weight neutral. He looked almost relaxed, but Lewis, studying him with a fighter's eye, could see the coiled readiness in every muscle. This was a man in complete control of this physical instrument, every fiber calibrated and responsive. Count, Bruce said quietly. Dan's voice cut through the silence. 1. Bruce didn't move. Lewis maintained his stance, every nerve firing, watching for the slightest indication of incoming attack. His peripheral vision was wide, his focus absolute. He'd trained for this his entire martial arts life, the moment of defended combat, reading an opponent's intention, responding with trained precision. Ter I2R, still nothing. Lewis's confidence began to rebuild slightly. Maybe this was just psychological warfare. Maybe, 3 sim, Bruce moved. It didn't look like movement at first. It looked like Bruce simply stopped being in one location and started being in another, as if he'd skipped the space between. No wind-up, no chambering, no telegraphing of intention. His lead hand struck Lewis's chest, a light tap, but unmistakably a hit, before Lewis's brain fully registered that Bruce had closed the distance. Lewis's hands came up in a classical high block, exactly as he'd been trained, protecting his head and upper body with perfect textbook form. Bruce's second strike came from a completely different angle, a low slap to Lewis's lead thigh that bypassed the high guard entirely. Lewis adjusted, attempting to drop his defense to cover the lower gates, shifting his weight to check the leg strike, according to traditional defensive principles. Bruce's third strike tapped his jaw. Somehow Bruce's hand had traveled in an arc that seemed physically impossible, coming from outside Lewis's peripheral vision, at a speed that didn't match any human movement Lewis had ever encountered. And 4 up, Lewis threw a desperate counterpunch, his powerful right hand shooting forward with enough force to drop an opponent. But it found only empty air. Bruce had already moved, flowing around the attack like water around stone. The fourth strike tapped Lewis's kidney. The fifth struck the back of his head, gentle, controlled, but undeniably a kill shot if it had been delivered with intent. 5 and Lewis spun, trying to face the threat, resetting to his fighting stance, his mind racing to understand what had just happened. 5 strikes. He'd been hit 5 times and he'd barely seen 2 of them. His blocks had been perfect, textbook classical defense, and they'd been completely irrelevant. Bruce stood 10 feet away again, exactly where he'd started, breathing normally, looking at Lewis with an expression that contained no triumph, no mockery, only patient waiting. 6, 7, 8, 9. The counts echoed in the sudden silence like a judge's gavel. Lewis stood frozen, his chest heaving not from physical exertion but from the cognitive dissonance of what he'd just experienced. Every certainty he'd built his martial arts identity upon had just been dismantled in less than 5 seconds of actual movement. The blocks he drilled 10,000 times, useless. The distancing strategy he'd mastered, bypassed the fighting stance that had never failed him, penetrated as if it didn't exist. The other students watched in absolute silence, recognizing the sacred nature of what they were witnessing. This wasn't a fight. This was a teaching. The destruction of an old understanding to make space for a new one. Lewis's hands were trembling slightly, not from fear, from something deeper. The ground beneath his understanding of martial arts had just shifted, and he was struggling to find his footing on new terrain undone. How? His voice came out rough, barely above a whisper. How did you Bruce moved closer, his expression gentle now, recognizing the vulnerability in the question. Your stance is strong, Joe. Your technique is excellent. You've clearly trained with dedication and discipline. But your traditional form made you predictable. You chambered your hands at your ribs, which meant every block required you to travel a specific distance before you could defend. You distributed your weight in a classical pattern, which meant your mobility was limited to certain directions. You watched for specific types of attacks, because that's what you've been trained to see in tournaments. He paused, letting Lewis absorb the analysis. I didn't beat your technique, I beat your limitation. The rules you've internalized about how fighting works, those rules created blind spots, and I moved through those blind spots. Lewis felt something break inside him, not his spirit, something else. The rigid container he'd built around his understanding of what was possible. It shattered, and through the cracks, he could suddenly see so much more. Years of training hadn't been wasted. It had been incomplete, like learning to read in only one language and suddenly discovering that libraries existed filled with books in languages he didn't know he didn't know. Teach me, he said, and there was no shame in his voice now, only hunger. The particular intensity of someone who had just glimpsed a horizon they hadn't known existed. Whatever that was, teach me. Bruce smiled then, a genuine expression of respect and recognition. That's why you're here, isn't it? Not to prove you're the best, but to become better than you are now? Lewis nodded slowly, his massive frame somehow seeming more humble than it had 15 minutes ago. I thought I was good. I thought I understood fighting. You are good, Bruce said firmly. You're better than 99% of martial artists walking this earth, but you've been training within artificial boundaries. Classical forms are beautiful. They're the accumulated wisdom of centuries. but they were designed for different contexts, different weapons, different social circumstances. The world has changed, combat has changed, we have to evolve or become irrelevant. He gestured to the space around them, encompassing not just the garage but something larger, a philosophy, a methodology, an approach to truth. What I practice, what I am developing, I call it Jeet Kune Do, the way of the intercepting fist. It's not a style. It's a philosophy. Take what works from every system. Discard what doesn't. Add what is uniquely your own. Don't get locked into classical methods. Don't worship tradition. Test everything. Keep only what survives contact with reality. Lewis absorbed the words like rain on drought-hardened soil. Everything Bruce was describing ran counter to the traditional martial arts philosophy he'd been immersed in. The idea that ancient kata contained all wisdom, that forms perfected over centuries shouldn't be questioned, that loyalty to style was a virtue, but he just experienced the limitation of that philosophy in the most direct way possible. "Can I train here?" Lewis asked. The question came out simply, without ego, the request of a student rather than a champion. "You can train with me," Bruce corrected gently, "not as master and student in the traditional sense, as training partners. You have knowledge I don't have, your power generation, your conditioning methods, your tournament experience. I have knowledge you don't have. We'll exchange, we'll both become better." He extended his hand. Lewis looked at it for a moment, understanding the significance of the gesture. This wasn't just an agreement to train, it was an acceptance of a fundamentally different relationship to martial arts. From rigid loyalty to style, to flexible loyalty to effectiveness. From comfort and certainty to growth through questioning. From the safety of tradition to the risk of innovation. He reached out and gripped Bruce's hand. The handshake was firm, respectful, the physical contract between two warriors choosing to build rather than destroy. Dan Inosanto, watching from the side, would later say it was the moment Joe Louis' real education began. Not the 3 years in Okinawa, those had built a foundation, but the foundation had been limiting him. Bruce had just blown open the walls, and Joe was about to discover how much further he could go without them. The next 3 years would reshape American martial arts in ways that would echo for generations. Joe Louis didn't just train with Bruce Lee. He absorbed the philosophy of efficiency, directness, and constant evolution. He took his formidable traditional foundation and liberated it from its classical constraints. His devastating reverse punch became faster, more fluid, more adaptable. His tournament record, already impressive, became legendary. But more importantly, the way he thought about fighting transformed completely. He began teaching, sharing not just techniques but the mindset Bruce had given him. The idea that effectiveness mattered more than tradition, that questioning was more valuable than blind acceptance, that evolution was not betrayal but honoring the deeper purpose of martial arts. When Bruce Lee died in 1973, too young, too soon, Joe Louis was among those who carried the torch forward. He became one of the primary ambassadors of Jeet Kune Do philosophy, one of the voices that kept Bruce's revolutionary approach alive when it could easily have died with its creator. He went on to become one of the fathers of American kickboxing. Blending his traditional karate background with Bruce's intercepting philosophy and elements from boxing, creating something new that would influence combat sports for decades. His students would go on to win championships. His teaching methodology would spread through multiple generations. But whenever people asked him about his greatest accomplishment, Joe Louis would often return to a moment in a converted garage in Los Angeles. 9 seconds that demolished his certainty and rebuilt his understanding on a stronger foundation. Decades later, in seminars and interviews, Louis would tell the story with something like reverence in his voice. "I walked into that school thinking I was going to show Bruce Lee that traditional karate was superior," he'd say, his aged face carrying the wisdom of a lifetime spent pursuing martial excellence. "Instead, he showed me I'd been fighting with one hand tied behind my back, and the hand that was tied was my mind. He didn't tom-bully me, he liberated me. That's the difference between a fighter and a teacher. A fighter breaks you, a teacher breaks your limitation." He'd pause, and anyone watching closely would see the emotion in his eyes, gratitude for a lesson that hurt in the moment but paid dividends for a lifetime. People always want to know who would win in a fight. Bruce or me, Chuck Norris, whoever. They missed the point completely. Bruce wasn't trying to defeat us, he was trying to elevate us. And he did. Every one of us who trained with him became not just better fighters, but better thinkers. He gave us permission to question everything, including him. That's a gift very few teachers are secure enough to give. Somewhere in your life right now, there's someone who believes they have nothing left to learn. Maybe it's someone at work who dismisses new methods because they've always done it this way. Maybe it's a family member who can imagine their understanding might be incomplete. Maybe it's someone close to you who stopped growing because they've mistaken competence for mastery. Maybe it's you. Ask yourself this. What are you certain about? What belief have you built your identity on? What understanding do you defend? Because questioning it would require admitting you've been operating with incomplete information. And here's the harder question. What would you do if someone demonstrated to you in less than 9 seconds that your certainty was actually a limitation? Would you defend your old understanding? Would you feel humiliated and retreat? Would you become an enemy of the person who showed you your blind spots? Or would you do what Joe Lewis did? Would you recognize the gift in the moment of discomfort? Would you have the courage to say, teach me, when everything in you wants to say you're wrong? Would you be willing to let your certainty shatter so that something stronger could be built in its place? Because here's what that moment in 1967 really teaches us. The strongest people aren't the ones who never bend. They're the ones who can break and rebuild themselves stronger. The wisest people aren't the ones who have all the answers. They're the ones still hungry for better questions. The most dangerous people aren't the ones who've mastered one system. They're the ones who've learned to take the best from everything and discard what doesn't serve them. Joe Lewis walked into Bruce Lee's school as a champion, certain of his superiority, ready to prove his tradition was supreme. 9 seconds later, he bowed, not in defeat, in recognition, in gratitude, in the beginning of a transformation that would define the rest of his life and influence thousands of people who never even knew his name. That's not weakness. That's the strongest thing a person can do. To let go of comfortable certainty and reach for uncomfortable growth. Bruce Lee could have destroyed Joe Lewis's confidence that day. He could have humiliated him, sent him away broken, created an enemy that would have been easy, that would have proven Bruce's superiority in the moment. Instead, he did something infinitely more difficult and more powerful. He turned a potential enemy into a lifelong student. He transformed pride into humility and humility into wisdom. He planted a seed that would grow into forests. That's the real lesson. When you're right and someone else is wrong, you have two choices. You can destroy them and prove your point, or you can teach them and multiply your impact. One path gives you a momentary victory and a permanent enemy. The other gives you a lifelong ally and a legacy that outlives you. Joe Lewis chose growth over pride. Bruce Lee chose teaching over domination. And the ripple effects of those 9 seconds are still spreading today, decades after both men have passed. In every dojo where students are taught to question, to test, to evolve rather than to blindly follow tradition. The question isn't whether you'll face your own 9 seconds of shattered certainty. You will, life guarantees it. The question is what you'll do when that moment arrives. Will you bow or will you break? One leads to transformation. The other leads to irrelevance. 9 seconds, that's all it took to change everything. How long will your moment take? And more importantly, will you recognize it when it comes?